So the tradition seems to have been established at the start of every lockdown talk, begins with something about lockdown hair or beard, and secondly, that this isn't the way we planned it. And that's completely true. We talked about this series in our elders' meetings. We had no idea we'd be talking about worship when we're all not together to do it. Yet hopefully that different context has given us a new perspective on what worship really means. I heard Pete Gregg in a talk recently talking about how we have been reclaiming the home as holy space. And I hope and pray that this has been your experience too. Our series started in April with David Spriggs, and he talked about how as we meet with God we can be overwhelmed, overawed with his holiness and our brokenness, and that our worship comes from a place of brokenness, of confession and forgiveness. Doug spoke next on the huge, enormous vision of God in worship and prayer that Paul had and that we share, and talking about worship being declaring God's worth in prayer. Ian Bruce spoke from the beginning of Acts, the Pentecost story, where the disciples prayed and waited for God and the Holy Spirit arrived in power. They were moved from worship to witness, sharing God's good news, ignited and empowered by the Spirit. Nigel White took us to the book of Revelation and a vision of Jesus for the suffering church and a reassurance that patient endurance is worship. And then last week, Glyn Oliver, speaking from the book of Romans, told us about how we can dedicate our whole life to God as worship. And so we come to the last of our series on worship and wisdom, heading back into the Old Testament to the wisest man who ever lived, King Solomon. Thank you, Sarah, for reading the passage from 2 Chronicles 1 that tells us about how Solomon was given wisdom by God. Solomon is brand new to the throne. The last verses of 1 Chronicles are about how Solomon is anointed to be king as David dies. And as we start the sequel, the new king's first act is to travel to worship God. He goes to the ancient tabernacle that was created at the instructions God gave to Moses, and he sacrifices. And after that, God meets with him and makes him an offer. Just a couple of things I want to notice really quickly before we move on. Firstly, when God offers Solomon whatever he wants, it's not at some random time. It's not just the beginning of his reign, it's immediately after Solomon worships the Lord. And secondly, Solomon was not alone in that worship. He and the assembly sought the Lord before the altar, the king and all the people. It says that he burnt 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord. I'm guessing not on his own. So God's offer to Solomon comes not out of his individual piety, his prayer life, his quiet times on his own in his room, but from choosing to worship with others, to make the worship of the Lord the flagship policy of his rule for all the people. In 1 Kings, the other version of this story has Solomon showing his wisdom by judging between two women and the baby they both claim to be theirs. But in Chronicles, Solomon gathers wealth and sets straight to building the temple of God. Now this was something that David, his father, had dreamed of, but he was told by God he was not to do it. Solomon, your son, will build the temple. Solomon's wisdom is seen in his actions, preparing resources, building the temple, and furnishing it. All of these as worship of God. Again, clearly, he's not on his own. In fact, he needs the support of pagan kings from the nations around to do all he's planned. Solomon takes what is good and makes it holy to worship the Lord. Wisdom isn't isolationist or even independent. There's no sense of national exceptionalism in building the temple. Solomon wants the best the world can offer to honour his God, and he will take it, remake it, and make the most glorious building of worship imaginable. Solomon prepares to dedicate the temple to God's worship by inviting all the people, and again by sacrificing. The priests carry in the Ark of the Covenant. It's a link to the old tabernacle and a symbol of God's promises to Israel and to Moses. And they place it in the temple. As they come out, I'm reading from 2 Chronicles 5:13, the trumpeters and musicians joined in unison to give praise and thanks to the Lord. Accompanied by trumpets, cymbals and other instruments, The singers raised their voices in praise to the Lord and sang, "He is good, his love endures forever." Then the temple of the Lord was filled with the cloud, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Chapter 6, verse 1, Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I've built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. Then he said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hands has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to my father David. For he said, 'Since the day I brought my people out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe of Israel to have a temple built so my name might be there. Nor have I chosen anyone to be ruler over my people in Israel. But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people Israel.' My father David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, 'You did well to have it in your heart to build a temple for my name. Nevertheless, you are not the one to build the temple, but your son, your own flesh and blood. He is the one who will build the temple for my name.' The Lord has kept the promise he made. I have succeeded David my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel, just as the Lord promised. And I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. There I have placed the ark, which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with the people of Israel." And Solomon continues in this long prayer, asking for God's presence in the temple, and that God would listen when his people call on him. He asks that when the people forget God and are punished, that God would forgive and return them to the land. Solomon's wisdom, for the writer of Chronicles at least, comes from knowing his place in the story of God, of knowing the plans of God. It's worth pausing to ask for a moment, who is writing this? Who's it for? I always think it's important to understand a passage in its real context. People who've studied this way more than I have say that the chronicler, the writer of the Chronicles, was not writing at the time of the kings, but much later, hundreds of years later. The Jewish people have been conquered, taken away to Babylon as slaves and as prisoners of war. As some of them start to return and rebuild, they remembered how things used to be. It's thought that it's at this time the Chronicles were put together, from a range of different sources. Perhaps it might even have been Ezra the priest, who led the people at the time of the return from exile, who did this. So Solomon in his insight understands the bigger story that he's a part of. It stretches right back to the Exodus, even before to the patriarchs. But God brought his people out of slavery in Egypt. God made promises to his people. If they were to follow the law, then he would always be with them and protect them. Those promises to Israel then echoed and deepened in his promises to David, that he would be king, that his sons would always be king. Again, with the caveat about following God. Solomon, it seems, knew that despite God's promise, his sons would not always follow God, and there would be bad times and even exile ahead, but that God would not give up on his people. We too need to know the story that we're a part of and use that in our worship too. We may not have the wisdom of Solomon, but we are given the Holy Spirit, God's wisdom, to live inside us. We may not always listen to the Spirit's voice, but he is always ready to speak to us. So if the key points for Solomon were Exodus, Kings, and exile, what are the key points for us? Well, the story of Israel is our backstory. Our story begins and ends with Jesus. His life, death, resurrection, his ascension, the giving of the Holy Spirit are the start of our story. We need to know it to understand it. And we need to know there is nothing conditional in that story like there was for Solomon. God's presence with us does not depend, not on anything, not on our circumstances, not on our faithfulness, not on how much we deserve it, or don't deserve it. God's presence does not depend on us doing good things or saying nice things or worshipping or praying or giving away our money. Our story is that God is with us. God is on our side. God is not giving up on us. The midpoint of our story, where we are, is the church, us, sharing his presence, his good news with the whole world, with the aim in mind of the future, of all things being brought together in Jesus. That presence of God becomes perfect as heaven and earth become one place. That's the story that we celebrate. So what can we learn about the wisdom of worship? Firstly, Solomon put worship as the first priority. It was from there that the wisdom and everything else came, because he put God and God's worship first. And we should be doing the same. Secondly, for Solomon, worship was with others. It wasn't alone, it was with all the people. He would stand up and pray and lead celebrations of God's glory. And for us, we are connected. Maybe we're socially distant right now, but we're connected by the Spirit. We're connected through these videos and services to each other. And we can share that connection and spread that to others. I wonder how many of you have shared a passage that's been meaningful to you, a song, a prayer, or even a service with other people. Research that has been out recently has told us that many more people are connecting with God and with churches during lockdown than they otherwise would have done. So there's nothing to lose by inviting somebody to come and experience and meet God. And they may find that transforming wonder that you found too. Third thing is that Solomon knew his place in the story. He understood what God had done in the past, that God was still acting, and how God would be into the future. And it's the same for us. We can be confident of the presence of God with us because we know what God has done in Jesus. We know that he's here with us in the Spirit, and we know what God will do as he brings all things together. It seems the perfect time to thank God, to bless the people, and just to give glory to his name. Amen.